G'day, mate. Luke Ford here, talking religion, talking faith, talking journey, and I'm here with Alexander. And Alexander, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from in a religious and faith perspective?
Sure. So the username I go online by is Leo Pirate. So if you want to search that on YouTube, you can find my channel and my videos. And as far as religion and faith goes, I was raised Roman Catholic. But as I went through college years, I kind of became an atheist. I drifted from that faith. But more recently, I'd say with just the information that's available online, I found a lot of merit to the teachings of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And in the last couple of years, I've been baptized into the church. I've been studying a lot about it. And on my channel, if you search Leo Pirate, I do some religious propaganda videos, which are a little shocking to say the least. Certainly not for children, not safe for work. But I basically take a Bible verse and some video content I find just on YouTube or on the internet and mash them together and see what you come up with on your own. That's where I am.
So Leo the Pirate is your YouTube channel?
Sure. Yep. There's no the, so just Leo.
Okay.
Pirate, all one word. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Here, let me just look you up. And how long have you had a YouTube channel?
Since 2007. So for a long time.
Okay.
Grandfathered in.
Oh, excellent.
And the tone of the channel has changed a lot. I used to do gaming videos. I still kind of do, but the truth is I'm just so busy with real life stuff. I update it like once every 6 months. And the video series I talked about earlier, I call them the Two Witnesses. It's just this playlist of that kind of content. I try to update that a little bit more frequently because they're very short and they take no time to make, like half an hour max. It's very short and easy to do.
Oh, excellent. Okay, but, so you converted to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I found your channel particularly interesting. I think I saw you as a recommendation when I was watching a different stream talking about the liberalist movement led by Sargon of Akkad. You know about that.
I know about Sargon. I know about the liberalist movement, but I'm just shocked that I was a recommendation from there.
Yeah, and I just decided to listen in on your stream, and you seemed like an interesting guy. And what I found particularly shot out to me was it said in your description that you were a former Seventh-day Adventist converted to Judaism. And then I decided to do a little more research into you, and I found out you're somewhat well known for your history in pioneering the blogosphere because of original websites, sort of seedy interactions with the porn industry.
Yes. Yeah, I started blogging July 3 of 1997.
And yeah, I guess the reason why I've been wanting to have this discussion for some time is I just wanted to know, what is it that led you specifically to Judaism? What about the Seventh-day Adventist Church, whether the modern one or its doctrines from the past that you rejected? And if you don't mind, I actually need to pull up the chat. So give me 1 second.
Yeah. So I'll just talk while you pull everything up. So folks, if you've never heard about Seventh-day Adventism, or you're curious to learn more about the Seventh-day Adventist Church in which I was raised, my recommendation of the best single book, and this would probably be the most common recommendation by religious scholars and also by many Seventh-day Adventists, and that would be it's a scholarly work written by two no longer Adventists, but it's called Seeking a Sanctuary, Seventh-day Adventism and the American Dream by Malcolm Bull and Keith Lockhart. They had a new edition, came out in 2006, and it looks at the Seventh-day Adventist Church as a reaction to the United States of America.
I'll be sure to check it out, add to my reading list. And I have the chat open right now. You said that it was 2 books, or was it authored by 2 men?
Authored by 2 men. This is the second edition. So the first one came out about 20 years ago, and they had extensive help from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So even though these guys are no longer Seventh-day Adventists, the Seventh-day Adventist Church considered them fair. And so the Seventh-day Adventist Church cooperated in great depth to enable them to produce a particularly accurate analysis.
So you said Seeking the Sanctuary?
The title is called Seeking a Sanctuary, Seventh-day Adventism and the American Dream. So it looks as the Seventh-day Adventist Church as a reaction to the United States of America.
Okay, cool. No, definitely we'll check it out, because the history of Seventh-day Adventism, I know a little bit about, how it started out in the Millerite movement. He was just a Baptist preacher from Batavia, New York. No, not Batavia. He's from New York for sure, but he started as a Baptist minister, and William Miller is most known for the Great Disappointment. Everyone seems to just only know him by that. He didn't do anything else. That's all he's known by. And it was him predicting a year when Jesus Christ would arrive, the second coming. Now, no one seems to bother researching the other things that he talked about, like the prophecies from Daniel, the statue or the idol that Nebuchadnezzar had in his dream and its relevance to our day and age. Instead, they only focus on the Great Disappointment. And what came from that is a branch, or splitting off, if you will, of Jehovah's Witnesses, and then what would soon then become the Seventh-day Adventist Church, with people who were originally in the Millerite movement. But the interesting thing is people often mistake that the Seventh-day Adventist movement was the one that made that prediction, or that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has any kind of specific date for when Jesus Christ will come back, when the Bible very clearly says, Jesus himself says that no man knows the hour or day. So I just wanted to clear that up.
Okay, great. Yeah, these are topics quite familiar from my upbringing at Avondale College, which is a Seventh-day Adventist college, about 2 hours drive north of Sydney. And then I spent 9 of my first 11 years pretty much at or around Avondale College. And then I spent a couple of years in Manchester when my dad was doing his second PhD at Manchester University. He did second PhD in biblical eschatology, in particular at Daniel 8:14 and the abomination of desolation. And then we moved to Pacific Union College, another Seventh-day Adventist college, this one in the Napa Valley in California, where I spent 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and then all the time that I could in high school after my father was removed from the Seventh-day Adventist Church ministry.
Which I saw on your Wikipedia page. It was a Desmond Ford. He had a criticism of the heavenly sanctuary doctrine. And I'm wondering, was that your reason for leaving the church, or was that just your father?
Yeah, that was just my father. He had theological disputes with the church. I was in 8th grade, so I didn't really have any theological disputes with the church when I was in 8th grade, but I was at Glacier View when all this went down. So the church is elite scholars, elite administration hierarchy, all gathered at the Seventh-day Adventist Glacier View retreat near Denver, Colorado, for a week in August of 1980. And that's when my father was removed as a result of that week-long conference. He was removed from church ministry. And then my father, for probably still to this day, still considers himself a Seventh-day Adventist, or at least he did for a long time, even though he was no longer employed by the church after August of 1980.
There's something really similar happening within the church right now, not necessarily with the heavenly sanctuary doctrine, but with the Godhead, the God we worship. There's a current controversy, if you will, about the Trinity. There's a big portion of the church, which I like to consider I'm a part of, that doesn't believe there's biblical evidence for the Trinity, and that there's actually quite a bit of historical evidence to show that it came from the First Council of Nicaea, and that it may have existed even earlier from Babylonian religions. And I highly recommend this religious pamphlet from the 1850s called The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop. I'm going through it right now. Really eye-opening stuff, especially regarding that topic. But yeah, it brings me back to you, how you're saying I've actually heard pastors that are being censured from the church because they hold the view that God the Father is not a Trinity. And that's hey, that's a lot of parallels right now. The church is taking precedence over biblical interpretation, and I don't necessarily agree with that.
I know how shocked my stepmother was the first time she met a Christian who did not believe in the Trinity, and so that was in England. in around 1970, 71. It was shocking. So in the Seventh-day Adventist church that I grew up in, every theologically literate person that I was aware of believed in the Trinity. But of course, as you say, the Trinity is not a scriptural doctrine, and it's also a logical impossibility.
Yeah, and that's a big reason why I subscribe to that belief. I just believe that there is two divine beings, God and his Son, and the Holy Spirit is the life that they have. Because we all have spirits, we all have breaths, but the nephesh, the Holy Spirit of God, is his holy life. And because of the sacrifice of his Son, we have access to that. The Bible doesn't describe the Holy Spirit as a third person. There's a lot of conjecture around it. There are particular verses people use as evidence, but I found for every single one, they require you to already believe in the Trinity. But, you know, we could talk about this stuff forever. So going back to you, I was more interested in what is it that led you specifically to Judaism? Because I saw in your Wikipedia article, you said that Dennis Prager was a huge influence on your conversion.
Right. So we should perhaps we should start with what led me out of the church.
Oh, sure. Yes. Yes.
So I was a kid, and so I was affected by what happened to my father. I was there at Glacier View, and I was just graduated 8th grade. So I was obviously biased when I saw my father attacked by Neil Wilson and dressed down by Neil Wilson and yelled at by Neil Wilson. Neil Wilson was the CEO of the Seventh-day Adventist Church at the time. And I believe his son is the CEO of the Seventh-day Adventist Church currently.
Elder Wilson? Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's his son. He's the son of the man who got my father out of the church. And so I experienced all this drama, and it interfered with my happiness. It was psychologically upsetting. I remember when I was there at Glacier View, and I jumped in the pool, and this older gentleman said, "Who are you?" And I responded, "I'm the son of the man you're burning at the stake." So
yeah.
I remember seeing Elder Wilson, who was the CEO of the Seventh-day Adventist Church at the time. He dressed down my father, and my father said, "Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God." So he was quoting Martin Luther, who's putting himself in a long line of Christian martyrs, was going back to Jesus, essentially. And so I saw my father as a heroic figure who had been persecuted by the church for pursuing the truth. But I was really unhappy that this meant that we'd no longer be living at Pacific Union College, where I was very happy. And we had to move about 2.5 hours drive away. And for the first time, I started going to a non-Seventh-day Adventist school. I went to an evangelical Christian Protestant day school for 9th grade. But this transition kind of out of Adventism, and my father starting his own evangelical, non-denominational Christian ministry, Good News Unlimited, it ripped me from the community that I'd known. And
I would imagine, yeah.
I was very unhappy. I failed 2 classes in 9th grade, even though I'd never been a good student. I'd never failed a class. I was breaking out in hives all the time. I was just a pretty unhappy kid, and my parents were in some financial difficulty, and so I managed to persuade them to allow me to go to the public school starting in 10th grade, because I really wanted to take a class in journalism. And so because they were in such great financial difficulty and I was very unhappy, they allowed me to go to public school. And so the environment that you're in just has a profound effect on you. And public school was a shock. I mean, there were people smoking. There was no smoking in the upbringing I had.
Right.
There are people who would drink, at least certainly on the weekends. There was no drinking in the atmosphere.
That culture shock for sure.
Right. People were telling dirty jokes, and there were no dirty jokes publicly told in my Seventh-day Adventist upbringing. Yeah, kids privately would tell them, but you would never tell them to a stranger. You would never just publicly relay dirty jokes. So the whole I grew up in a holy atmosphere where the presence of God was very real. Mm-hmm. And as we moved out of the church, the presence of God was not nearly as real. And then there was another very important development. Because my dad was under so much pressure, he needed some way to relax. And so for the first time in my life, we got a TV. And wow. I fell in love with TV. And my parents tried to circumscribe how much I could watch. But when they were gone, I watched all I could. And so I fell in love with TV, and it just made me like hypersexual. Because I mean, the thing I see on TV is like hot-looking chicks, like Charlie's Angels, and Farrah Fawcett didn't appear to be wearing a bra in that show, and it was just amazing. And on PBS, sometimes they would show English BBC TV shows, and there'd be nudity, and it's like, whoa, this is amazing, fantastic. And it took me out of my misery of not being connected to the community that I grew up in. I found like this coping tool, which quickly became an addiction to pornography, but it transfixed me out of my misery. It was a tool. Also, I love watching TV sports. I love watching the news. I just became fascinated with all things TV. Combine that.
I can't help but laugh. Someone in the chat by the name of Jeffson, he said, TV leads to Judaism? I'm shocked. Which I don't know why. Just an interesting point. But you said you got into TV sports. And
I was like, I became like, sex was on my mind. Like, I think other people at school were having it. Like, I didn't get anywhere close to having it. But at least
at that age too.
I saw it when it's introduced about on TV. So if you compare the attractions of like, visceral sexual appeal with an invisible, unknowable God, like visceral sexual appeal was winning out. I started buying Penthouse magazines and like hiding them in the bushes outside my home or under the house, so I could go visit them regularly. And I became the editor of my high school newspaper. I worked for the local radio station reporting the news. I wrote for the local newspaper, the Auburn Journal. So I became very excited by the secular world, by the practice of journalism. It was like a press pass to enter every part of life that on my own awkward self I couldn't really enter. So there's this exciting sexual secular world out there that I wanted it. It was just viscerally much more compelling than my father's sermons about God and our own struggling non-denominational evangelical Christian church that we would go to, where about half the people who went to it were these mentally retarded girls that had been adopted by some family that got accused of sexually molesting them. So like compared to being around all these retarded girls and the struggling church and having this hole in my soul because I don't have the community that I grew up with, and so I'm getting more and more tied into the visceral appeal of the secular world. And after high school, I went back to live with my brother for a year, and he was an atheist. So I quickly got a job that involved working on the Sabbath, so I completely stopped going to church, and I worked 6 days a week. And the Sabbath ceased being a significant day for me. And when I came back to California, I worked radio news on the weekends. Like I was the anchor reporter. I was the news guy on the weekends of the radio station. So I enjoyed that press pass to cover the news, but I wasn't keeping the Sabbath anymore. I now said that I was an atheist. And I had an employer in landscaping who was an Assembly of God, so Pentecostal Christian. And he would say to me, look, you're such a nice guy, you're so ethical, it makes no sense that you're not a Christian. And I said, well, if you're a Christian, you have to live your life for God. You have to make God first. And I want to do what I want to do. I don't want to humble myself before God. I just want to do my own thing. Now, I still hadn't even had sex at this point, but I was dying to.
I was actually, if you don't,
dying to get into the world.
I wanted to bring this up to you because I noticed this while reading through 1 Corinthians, and it goes back to the Torah, which I'm sure you know quite a bit about. In it, the Apostle Paul warns about fornication, and he says, "Do not lust after fornication as those did in the wilderness." Now, I'm sure you know the wilderness is in Numbers. Now, the interesting thing is in Greek, the word for fornication is porneia. It's the derivation of what we get for porn. So it's interesting that's in Greek because the New Testament's written in Greek. Now let's go back to the Old Testament, the book of Numbers, describing the Israelites' journey on the way to the promised land at Canaan. Now, I believe, at least from my own studies, that that journey in the wilderness is a parallel to God's remnant church today on our way to our promised land, heaven. Now, right when the children of Israel were right outside the border of Canaan, there's this character, I'm not sure if you remember, Balaam. He wanted to curse them. He wanted to curse them. Yeah. But the problem is he couldn't do it. Every time he tried to curse them, he accidentally blessed them. He couldn't control himself. And the reason why is because they remained obedient to the Lord. Now, under Satan's advisory, he realized, wait a minute, to get that favor taken away, why don't we send in the Moabite women, right, so that they can lust after fornication? And the Moabite women, you know, as I'm sure you know, started mating with the children of Israel, and they started bringing in their idols, and they committed fornication, or as in the New Testament Greek, porneia. So it's interesting how right outside the land of Canaan, right outside the promised land, they were distracted by fornication. Yeah. So it's just, I found that parallel just really, really relevant in today's world, especially with the internet. You were talking about TV, but the internet, it's just right there, anywhere.
Yeah, so we didn't have the internet yet, but it was like on the top of my mind. And I eventually started taking school seriously. I got straight A's. I got admitted to UCLA and its economics program. So I'm finally set to go to a prestigious university. I've been going to community college and working in radio. I've saved like over $30,000 from my hard work, and like my life looks like it's just about to lift off and be fantastic. And then one morning in February of 1988, I woke up with what felt like a severe case of the flu. Only this thing never went away. Like this thing just had me in a vice that just started to narrow and narrow. I could no longer exercise. I could no longer work or study like I once did. I had to drop half my classes. I had to give up working. I stumbled off to UCLA hoping perhaps a change of location would help my health, but it didn't. I only managed to finish one class a quarter. It was complete humiliation. Everyone in the dorm said, "Oh, it's all in your head," because nobody could really locate the illness. After a year, it got the name chronic fatigue syndrome. But my life just fell apart. I was in bed 20 hours a day. And so all my plans, all my selfish ambition, all my hard work and discipline just came to absolutely nothing. And I was completely humbled and humiliated and depressed and could see no way out. And so when you're in a state of humility, you become open to things. Or someone else could argue that you lose your good judgment. So, I mean, there's either perspective. So I go to UCLA 3 weeks early to try to see some doctors that my mother recommended, now a month early. And so I sleep in the bushes because I don't want to pay for a hotel room and I didn't know anyone. I sleep in the bushes beside the girls' softball field. And because I'm so sick, I'm just listening to a lot of talk radio. And I'm cruising through the radio dial, land on AM 790, and there's this really deep voice talking about God and morality and right and wrong, and like this really speaks to me because it feels in many ways like the voice of God, and I feel like I'm hearing God talk to me through this man who turns out to be a Jew. And I've never knowingly met a Jew at this point in my life. I'm 22 years of age. And this guy's name's Dennis Prager. And it turns out he'd written a couple of books on Judaism. And he did this weekly show, Religion on the Line, where he had clergy from all the three major religions, Catholicism, Protestantism, and Judaism, to have them on every week to discuss various topics. And I was just so impressed by this man, Dennis Prager, and his voice spoke to me. And there's another huge or two huge psychological factors operating here. One is that I've always had the deepest of yearnings for a father figure. I've always had kind of an attenuated relationship to my own father. And so throughout my life, I've often spent more time trying to connect with my friends' fathers than with my friends at school. Or with teachers. Like I've always wanted a father figure, and this guy with his deep voice and his
conviction in morality.
Yeah, conviction. Like this was like the ultimate father figure. And then also because my own life was so screwed up, I needed someone to put on a pedestal and almost worship and like desperately try to connect with, to try to like hold on to life somehow. That like my own life was failing. I had no strength, no ability to do anything on my own. I felt if I could just hang on to this man who's succeeding, who's a great man, if I could just attach myself to a great man, then somehow I can be great too.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's a strong conversion story right there. So I think Prager University obviously occurred way later, but I have seen some of Dennis's videos. They're very, very interesting, very convincing, particularly the one where he talked about morality, where the code of morality dictates the behavior of man. And I remember watching that. That actually helped me form my idea of man as not a wind-up toy with the genes being the winding key. I see them more as a computer with hardware and software. And the software is the morality, and the hardware, the genes. They both play off each other, so you can't completely ignore genes, but that's really what man is. And it has that model, I believe, is far more nuanced than what a lot of the alt-right figureheads seem to have, where you're in this false dichotomy where either all race doesn't matter, we're all one, we're all the same, or hey, white people did all these great things, ergo they are the best, supreme, and we have to survive only on that, and the other races are inferior. Both worldviews completely ignore morality. And that's what I noticed from Prager's video series.
Yeah, so
I noticed.
Yeah, he's charismatic. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, this is a totally different topic. I also noticed he has a pretty mainstream opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It seems to mirror the Wikipedia articles and mainstream news outlets, but I'm sure that's much later on. You were talking about how when you first heard him on radio, he didn't have Prager University when he was on radio.
Right, he had a local radio show, but it was a huge in the ratings. It would get about a 10 rating, so 10% of all people listening to the radio at that time were listening to him. But they couldn't sell ads against it because the content was so religious that not many people wanted to advertise. So when I listened to things he said, they all made sense to me. I couldn't really puncture holes, and I started calling his show regularly to argue with him, and he always defeated me. And so that impressed me. And then when I entered UCLA, I encountered Jews in real life for the first time, and I became fascinated by them. I had an economics professor for 2 classes who was an Orthodox Jew. He was what's called a Bar Tshuva, someone who was raised secular but then became Orthodox in adulthood. And so I had a lot of these kind of discussions with him after class. And so that also stimulated my interest. Other Jews that I met got me interested. It's like I found people who had like a better way of living. They seemed closer to their families. They seemed more economically, professionally, educationally, socially successful. They seemed to have more influence, more power, more punch. They got more out of life. They were more passionate. They were winners. Also, I fell in love with Asians. I'd never really been around Asians before in any numbers. And I got the yellow fever. I got an Asian girlfriend. I just loved Asians. And so I was seeing like a better way of life. And I'd gone to UCLA with a very high opinion of my father. But after leaving UCLA, after just 9 months, suddenly I saw my father as this kind of broken man, and Dennis Prager became my father figure. So it was interesting that just 9 months away at university, and my view of my father completely changed, even though, of course, he did not change during those 9 months.
Yeah, and the secular world is just so different from what you grew up in, and seeing, as you said, the Jewish faith having that extra punch that perhaps you may have been lacking in your earlier faith. I certainly can say I grew up around a lot of Jews. I went to a public high school that was very close to the more Orthodox Jews. And I had many Jewish friends and while growing up, and it was interesting because I see, I guess, like what you experienced, I experienced at a much younger age. I noticed my Jewish friends lived in mansions, like huge houses, and in upstate New York, that's no small detail. That's like a big deal. I was like, wow. And yeah, I always noticed that. But they, at the time, I was raised Roman Catholic, and they would always make jokes about me, being Christian, crack jokes here or there. And they said, Jesus was a Jew? Things like that. That stuff I kind of remembered fondly from my childhood. And as I grew older, like I mentioned earlier, went into college, I then became fully immersed in the secular world because I just said, the story of Christ and the Roman Catholic Church, they're all based upon these archetypes with very strong moral principles. And it's about us seizing those moral principles. That's what religion is. It wasn't until later on, once I started to actually take the Bible and the Word of God seriously, I began to realize it's more than just that. These are real historical events that can be substantiated by secular historical evidence, secular scientific evidence, and it has within its pages prophecy. So your interest in Judaism came from that need of a father figure. For me, I think it came from more of a lack of foundation in moral principles in the secular world, because people just change left and right. But if this Bible, if what the Word of God says it's true, then that means the 10 Commandments is true. All of it, including the 4th commandment about remember the Sabbath, which, by the way, I'm sure you know, is the only commandment that has the word remember in it, as if you could forget it. But yeah, that's for me. That's, I guess, our parallels are going. Please continue on.
Well, so as I listened to Prager, he made a lot of sense, and I liked how real he was. Jews tend to be more frank. Christians tend to be nicer. Jews tend to be more visceral in their speech. So non-Jews will often find it crude or rude, but I found it excitingly real. And then I liked that Dennis had this very sharp, clear definition of evil as just gratuitous human cruelty, rather than simply having the wrong theological beliefs. And I liked that he hated evil, not people with different theologies than his own. I liked that he was so honest in stating he did not know why God created a world where there was unjust natural suffering. I liked how he would continually admit that he didn't know something, and he just seemed very open to truth from any source. And so he was open to these many conflicting values. So I could kind of hear the struggle in the way he would weigh things up. And he just seemed very fair. And then I liked his arguments for God's existence and for God's importance, that without belief in God, life has no ultimate meaning and there's no objective standard of good and evil. And then I liked his presentation of Judaism as this step-by-step detailed system for making a better world. And if you're going to change the world in a positive way, you need a system. And prior to Prager, I had been into Marxism for 2 or 3 years. Part of it was just kind of a performance art. I loved telling people that I was an atheistic communist.
Sure.
But I also found it interesting. I've often decided to like immerse myself in a world without taking it fully seriously. But I just wanted to, just dunk myself in the world of the Marxist outlook. But I thought Judaism made a lot more sense than Marxism, because Judaism focused on individual behavior and trying to get people right with God by morally educating them.
So it has a system, but you wouldn't say it's an objective, absolute moral truth. Do you believe in objective, absolute moral truth?
Yes. So okay. I understand it takes a leap of faith to get there, but I believe that the Torah comes from God, and the Torah reveals objective moral truth, and with the help of the Torah tradition to understand and interpret it in changing circumstances.
Yeah, you see, that was the big thing that kind of confused me about Judaism. Is there's the Torah, and then there's the Holy Talmud, and as you described, the tradition of interpreting the Torah. What do you hold in higher esteem, the Torah or the Holy Talmud?
I would hold the Torah in higher esteem, but the Talmud is more practical. So the
More
Talmud
practical.
is the basis for applying the Torah to changing circumstances. So before there was a Torah, there was an oral tradition. And then
Yes.
the oral tradition got compiled into the Torah. But alongside the Torah, there was then a new oral tradition discussing how to interpret it. So there's always been oral tradition throughout, every people's lineage, every people's history. It's only Protestantism that holds sola scriptura, the Bible, and the Bible only should be our creed. Every other religion, every other ethnic identity has oral tradition that goes back into the history.
But
So
the thing I found
it makes
interesting,
sense.
Luke, is that the Torah was written down and has been preserved, but according to the tradition, the oral tradition of the priests were given at Mount Sinai, and is that what makes up the Talmud? It's just been preserved orally, so it's not been written down. The first writings of it come in around 200 A.D. So it's like the
Okay,
Babylonians.
so as even before the Torah was written down, there were oral commentaries on the Torah on how to apply it in changing circumstances. For example, much of the Torah is about the sacrificial system, but there was no temple to perform the sacrifices until King Solomon built one, and then the Jews lost it on two different occasions. So how do Jews now relate to God without a temple? So you had an oral tradition that explained that.
I was going to say the third book of Moses, Leviticus, actually does describe, it doesn't quite describe the building of the Temple of Solomon, but it does describe the rites of sacrifice for ritual purity. It describes the priesthood, and it describes how to actually go about sacrificing the animals for things like sin offerings and apologies to God. They're all described in Leviticus, but you're correct. Yeah, the building of the Temple of Solomon is much later, after the Torah.
Right, so there was an oral tradition running side by side with the written Torah, or even before the Torah was put into final form. So this oral tradition was given down generation after generation, and it was finally written down because during the two main wars with the Romans, over 1 million Jews died. So a lot of that knowledge of the oral Torah was getting lost every time a Roman would cut some Jewish rabbi's head off. You were endangering the retention of the oral tradition. So it finally got written down and then edited and put into what's known as the Mishnah in year 200 of the Common Era. And then as soon as you had the Mishnah written down, then you had commentaries on the Mishnah. And so the Talmud is basically a shorthand of rabbis sitting around discussing and arguing over the Mishnah and the Tanakh. And that discussion is shorthand, and it is what composes the Talmud, which really is the commentary on the Tanakh and on the Mishnah.
Well, it's really interesting how you brought up how the Romans were killing the Jews in both the Bible and in Ellen White's writings, particularly The Great Controversy. The first chapter of that book is about the destruction of Jerusalem. And that was a really eye-opening chapter for me because it really follows what happened after Jesus Christ was crucified. The Pharisees and the Sadducees at the time, they believed that they were still under God's grace, and they still did animal sacrifices. They still kept the Sabbath too. But then they were surrounded by, the General Titus, and they were absolutely just destroyed. It was this total slaughter. Solomon's temple was destroyed. Blood came flowing like water out of the temple steps. And the interesting thing is not a single Christian died on that day, because Jesus Christ had warned them in advance that when your enemies surround Jerusalem, you should flee. And there was a brief pause when there was that surrounding of Jerusalem. And that's when the followers of Christ were able to escape. And it's really interesting how the Jews still kept the forms. They still kept the practices. They still kept the animal sacrifices. They still kept the Sabbath, but that didn't save them from the destruction of Jerusalem. But then you said it was because of all this mass killing, that's what led to the Talmud actually being written down, which I find really interesting because the Torah itself and a lot of the ancient scrolls were already written down. So commentaries about it only being passed orally just seems really, really odd to me. Because, I mean, I know that's the tradition, but the only written record we have starts around the Mishnah in the 200 AD.
Right, but before there was a written Torah, it was passed orally as well. So before there was a book of Jeremiah, it would been passed down orally for generations. So Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, wasn't composed by a bloke named Jeremiah sitting down and writing out the book. It was an oral tradition that eventually found written form. So the Mishnah is no different than the book of Jeremiah or the book of Deuteronomy or the book
Isaiah,
of Habakkuk or the book of Isaiah. These are all
first half,
things that started out as oral traditions and then finally got written down. And as far as observing the Sabbath not saving you from destruction, well, there's nothing that saves a people at all times and places from getting killed.
Oh, from getting killed, worldly, that's true. But the way that I've come to understand is evil in the world is the absence of the presence of God. And that moral system we're talking about before, that is embodied in the Ten Commandments, the only goodness that is of this world is the presence of God. And when it's removed, then you have mass killings, rapes, or what happened at the destruction of Jerusalem. That's when Satan is allowed to do whatever he wants. He's given authority to reign free. And that's what I'm saying. It's not necessarily by being a Seventh-day Adventist or a Christian, you're invincible from death. I would point you to the lives of the apostles. You know, the Apostle Paul was beheaded by the Emperor Nero. There's so many Christians to this day who are being slaughtered for their faith. That's clearly not what saves you from the worldly death, but it saves you from the second death. And I noticed that there's a bit of a difference between what Judaism holds as the second death and what Christians hold, because they don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, the King of the Jews. They don't accept that, if I'm correct, yes?
Well, yeah, I mean, Christian claims for Jesus are irrelevant to Jews, just as Muslim claims for Muhammad are irrelevant to Christians. You probably don't live your life feeling that you're rejecting Muhammad is simply irrelevant. And so whatever Christian claims are for Christ are just irrelevant to the Jew.
If the Bible spoke extensively about Muhammad in advance, hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years in advance, it predicted Muhammad and what he would do. Yeah, I'd feel kind of strange if I were to reject him, because, you know, Isaiah 53, which from the Dead Sea Scrolls you can date, definitely was written hundreds of years before Jesus, and yet it very clearly describes him as the lamb to the slaughter who opens not his mouth. And then John the Baptist introduced him as, behold, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world. And Jesus was the Passover lamb for Jews and Gentile, for the whole world that's willing to accept that sacrifice. So, I mean, yeah, I would actually. If Muhammad was really right in line with everything the Bible said and he was prophesied in advance, yeah, I would actually feel kind of confused to just completely reject him.
The people who can actually read the Tanakh in the Hebrew have never found anything about Jesus in there. So Christians can read back into that text and see Jesus all through it through the eyes of faith. But the people who are most literate and most at home in the Tanakh have never found any claim or evidence or prediction of some guy named Jesus in those pages.
Oh, sure. Well, it's interesting. On Google, you can actually see a scan of the original Isaiah scroll, like right from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a digital scan. And, you know, there were no verses or chapters. It's just compiled Hebrew on this like long scroll. But it's been digitally superimposed for you to be able to scan through. And in it, you can find, you know, the prophet Isaiah speaking to the house of David, meaning the descendants of King David. And he says, you know, behold, a virgin shall conceive, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, which, as you know, in the Hebrew means God with us. And the interesting thing is that was written around 700 BC, and he was speaking to the descendants of King David. Well, in the New Testament, in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 3, Mary's genealogy is laid out. And guess who's in Mary's genealogy? Oh, King David. And speaking of King David, I noticed this when I was on your channel header. You have that star. Many people call it the Star of David. What do you think it means? And if it's the Star of David, how is it attributed to David? Because I didn't see any star being attributed to David in First and Second Samuel or Kings.
I had no idea about someone made that header for me, and I said fine. So I confess I've never thought about the Star of David.
But it's it's a universal symbol of Judaism. It's on the flag of Israel. It just
yeah, I didn't have a big visual sense, so I don't really think that much about visual symbols. I know some people do. So according to Wikipedia, this symbol has never been a uniquely Jewish symbol. It's been used by printers since the 16th century, and it started being used by Jews in the 19th century.
Yes. It's interesting though, because that's what the secular world will say. Yeah, it's only been used fairly recently, but as you know, the Old Testament is much older than a lot of the historical things we have today. And in the prophet Amos from the Old Testament, if you do a search for the word Moloch, it actually appears only twice in the Bible, once in the Old Testament, once in the New Testament. And in the Old Testament, the prophet Amos is saying, but ye have borne the tabernacle of your Moloch and your images, the star of your God, which you made to yourselves. Now, that's kind of weird, a star associated with Moloch. That's strange. But in the New Testament, it's kind of illuminated or made a little bit more clear. The first Christian martyr, Stephen, before the Council of Jerusalem, gave a railing accusation to the Pharisees, saying that, not only did you kill Jesus Christ, he says, yea, you took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. So I decided to look into the star of Remphan, and it's actually much older. Remphan goes, at least his symbol, the six-pointed star, this hexagram, goes way back to even Babylonian religions. And I just found it interesting because people believe it's much more recent. But if you look into it, it actually goes way back. And it touches back on what I said earlier, The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop. If anyone's watching right now, please check it out. Eye-opening pamphlet. Because I just was interested. I've heard that your answer, Luke, from many Jews. I've asked you. I've asked Halsey. I've asked who else did I ask this to? At least 3 different Jews. I've asked them, what does that star mean? And they all just don't seem to know. It's really strange.
It has no important significance to Jews. It's just a symbol that was taken up by Jews in the 19th century. So it has no religious significance.
Because I always found it interesting, the menorah definitely has religious significance to Judaism. And yet I know it's in a lot of legal paperwork for the state of Israel. And I don't remember where I read this, but I heard there was actually a certain group of Jews that wanted the flag of Israel to actually have the menorah instead of this Star of David or whatever.
Right, the Star of David's a secular symbol, so the menorah is a religious symbol. So the modern state of Israel was overwhelmingly founded by secular Jews. But religious Jews, obviously, they look at the world very differently than atheist Jews.
That's actually really, I didn't consider that. I know Theodor Herzl is a big proponent for Zionism or the establishment of the state of Israel. And the Balfour Declaration was written to, the secular angle. I never considered that. That's interesting. Oh, cool. I will keep that in mind for the future. That may have answered my question. And wow, what are we even talking about at this point? We kind of straight off your life story and went way off into theological discussion. Let's reel it back. Let's bring it back. At this point, you said that you found a lot of value in Dennis Prager's teachings and the sort of conviction and the morality that he taught. And this all went off when I said, do you believe in absolute morality? And then we went on this huge tangent. We can go back to what you were saying.
Right. So I was fascinated by Judaism. And the more I read, the more fascinated and excited I was. And it was also a desperate point in my life. For 6 years, I was basically bedridden. And so I needed something to inspire me. So on a personal basis, Dennis Prager and some other Jews I knew inspired me, but I also needed a religion to inspire me. I also needed God to inspire me. And so the text that I read about Judaism inspired me and kept me going through these very dark days. It's like, oh, this is the thing that will help me lead a good life, a holy life, connect me to God, turn my life around. Give me meaning, help me get through this difficult time. Even if I never recover my health, here's my lifeline to God.
If you don't mind me asking, if when you were a Seventh-day Adventist, did you observe their dietary recommendations?
Yeah, I've been a lifelong vegetarian.
Nice, nice. I've only fairly recently gone into that path, and I can definitely say it's improved my health. There's bar none of all the exercises, of all the other advice I've been given. Being a vegetarian/vegan, easily bar none, best health advice I've been given and been following. But that's an example of these teachings that can come from religion and that you just observe without immediately looking into the scientific research. It's just follow this, and the benefits come. And that's something I found, like you said, the leap of faith. You don't need to go really far into the nitty-gritty details about why you need to follow a law. It's just follow it. I'm sure you know in Leviticus it says do not eat pork or shellfish. I don't eat either of those because shellfish are bottom feeders of the ocean, and it's like pork. I mean, you already know, if you're in today's meat industry, you're basically eating fecal matter. So it's really interesting. Rather than trying to have this huge debate, well, why would God recommend not eating pork or shellfish? If you just follow it, you'll get these quote unquote blessings. But the secular world has been able to describe the logical reasons for them.
Right. There's a text in the Torah that says if you observe my laws, you will have none of these diseases that the outside world has.
And he also, that's one dietary recommendation. The other one is idolatry. And it's really interesting because when I was reading sort of the Old Testament, the term idolatry seems so archaic, like just old fashioned, these giant statues that people are bowing down to. And I'm thinking, okay, this doesn't affect me at all today. But we talked earlier about pornography or pornea, fornication. And I've come to the conclusion that you can find a lot of these moral wrongdoings. They all go back to the 10 Commandments. And the second commandment is about bowing down or worshiping idols. That's the second commandment, And I think what it is today we have a modern form of digital idolatry on the screen. And people are sacrificing their seeds to this image that they see on their screen regularly. It's a huge addiction on the internet today. I have been hearing it's a bit of a what's the word I'm looking for? When a plague goes loose. It's pretty bad, and it's been worse than it ever has been. And so I find it interesting that with TV, for you, it started that way. And now with the internet, can you even imagine what it must be for the youths of today?
Yeah, I think it largely depends on whether you're basically securely attached. If you're a normal person who received consistent parenting, then you don't need to escape from reality nearly as much because you're basically fine and content with reality. But if you're half the population that doesn't have secure attachment, then you will often desperately feel the need to escape from reality. And then some people will escape into alcohol and drugs. Other people will escape into watching TV. Other people will escape into pornography. Other people will escape into sports addiction or gambling addiction. So I think I see these diseases as symptoms of a malaise, of not being connected to your best self, to other people, and to God. And whether they manifest in alcoholism or porn addiction or gambling addiction, that's just a different symptom. The basic disease is the same.
Yeah, no, definitely. I see them as signs of the kind of metaphysical slavery that they're engaged in. And that's what I found really interesting about Jesus's sort of sermons and teachings, is that in the Old Testament, the Hebrews were under the slavery of Egypt, and that was a physical type. In the New Testament, we talked about a metaphysical slavery, that's sin. And if you think about it, an alcoholic has less free will than a non-alcoholic, because they don't have the choice of not drinking that night. They have to drink that night. And eventually it gets to the point where their body has physical reactions to if they don't drink on that evening. And yeah, I definitely agree with you. It's a symptom of the slavery that they have been taken into, and they enter that slavery because of the lack of a connection with God or a strong moral standing. I wanted to ask you, do you still keep the Sabbath as an Orthodox Jew?
Yeah, absolutely. Very strict laws in Orthodox Judaism about how you keep the Sabbath. So you'll notice I do not stream on the Sabbath. I do not tweet on the Sabbath. I do not blog on the Sabbath. I'm not online on the Sabbath. I'm not going to be watching TV or using electronics on the Sabbath.
Oh, that's nice. Because that's it's really crazy. If you grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist church, I'm sure you know about the whole controversy between Sunday versus Saturday observance. And it's really crazy. The majority of the population, I'd say most of Christian denominations, observe Sunday as a day of worship. And if you go out on Sunday morning, Luke, and you just walk around the time Mass should be, you could almost see what the Sabbath should be like. There's like no cars. You don't hear them driving. A lot of restaurants are closed. Stores are closed. You can hear the birds chirping. It's that moment, but it's on a different day. And I'm not going to get into the history of that, but yeah, no, I totally agree. Sabbath observance is a really, really important part of a sign that you care about God's creation. And do you know about the three angels message?
I learned about it a lot growing up, but I couldn't recite it to you today.
Okay. But yeah, to sum it up really quickly, in Revelation, there are these three angels that give a final warning to the last generation on earth. And it's in Revelation chapter 14. I'm just going to read what one of them says. This is Revelation chapter 14. Let's see here. And there is Revelation 14, and this is what one of the angels, and I saw another angel flying in the midst, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell in the earth, saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of water. Now, the amazing thing, Luke, is that same exact wording appears in Exodus chapter 20, where the 10 commandments are laid out. And can you guess which commandment does that same exact wording appear? I'll just, for dramatic effect.
The fourth commandment, the one about the Sabbath.
Yep. And right there. But the seventh day is the day of the Sabbath of your Lord thy God. In it shalt thou not do any work. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. So you have both the Old Testament and the New Testament pointing to the Sabbath as this sort of sign of observance or obedience to the Heavenly Father who created heaven and earth through his Son. All things are created through his Son because he is his word. And, in Genesis, God spoke. He spoke and he created everything. And since Jesus is the word of God, all things are made through Jesus Christ. But yeah, it's interesting that Sabbath observance is taken by these two groups. I mean, are there many other religious groups that really take the seventh day of our Gregorian calendar quite as seriously? I know that there's the Jews and Seventh-day Adventists, and
yeah, there are other Christian groups that keep the Sabbath, but they're fairly small.
I think it's Seventh-day Baptists or something.
Yes.
I've done a little bit of research into it, and yeah, and I've looked into many historical figures who were Sabbath keepers. You don't need to be an SDA to keep the Sabbath, but yeah, I found that really bizarre how the fourth commandment has been removed and it says it's the Sabbath day, not an hour. Like Sunday.
Yeah.
So even if you think, oh, Sunday's the Sabbath, people only go for like 1 hour, go to church, observe these rituals, and then go about their day as if nothing happened. And that's how I felt when I was in Roman Catholicism. It just seemed very formal, like doing the bare minimum. So
yeah, people don't know anything about Seventh-day Adventism, just know that it is high-intensity religion. So mainstream Protestantism and most Catholics practice low-intensity religion. So it's not something that shapes their entire life. It's an adjunct to their life. But high-intensity religion is when religion shapes your life. Religion determines the boundaries of your life. Religion is the ultimate guide to your life. It's the ultimate arbiter of your life, and you live your life for your religion. You don't just add in a little religion on the side. So Seventh-day Adventism basically demands 1 day a week, the Sabbath, that you keep it holy. It demands 10% of your income that you give tithe. Seventh-day Adventists are highly committed to their religion. They have the biggest school system of any Protestant denomination. They have huge publishing operations because Seventh-day Adventists buy a lot of books. Seventh-day Adventists tend to devote a lot more time to studying the Bible than other Protestant denominations. They overall commit far more to their religion than other Protestant denominations. So it's a whole different level of intensity than your average Protestant.
But the thing is, and a very common misconception that people have, is that these people who observe that denomination are trying to win favor with God by doing more and more of his laws, by showing, ooh, who can be the best Christian? And that's not the case at all. I don't keep the law to be saved. I keep the law because I am saved. By having Christ's work.
A lot of that's your approach, but there are plenty of Seventh-day Adventists who keep the law because they believe that it will play a role in their salvation, and also because they want to appear as holier than thou. So Seventh-day Adventists are not exempt from human frailty and from a more law-based, works-based relationship to salvation. So you have 100% faith-based approach to salvation. So you're an evangelical Christian and a Seventh-day Adventist, but there are Seventh-day Adventists who are more legal-based.
If I may elaborate, that's not quite the position I'd hold. It's just, if you have a transforming faith, the law will naturally manifest in your actions and your life. And if you think that observance of the truth that God gave his only begotten son to die for the sins of the world is an intellectual exercise, if you think you just have it in your brain and that's it, that's like you said, evangelical Christianity. The investigative judgment that Seventh-day Adventists basically push, it's from the Bible, it's biblical, it's in Daniel, it's in Revelation, and all it does is just describe the process by which Jesus comes with the gifts to give those to reward according to their works. And, if I just go right here from, this is Jesus speaking, for the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he shall reward every man according to his works. Meaning, by the time Jesus returns from the clouds, when he comes and every eye shall see him, he has already made the judgment. Probation has already closed. Judgment has been made on those who have rejected him, and those who have accepted him will be rewarded according to their works. The heavenly sanctuary is spoken of in Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is almost entirely about that. And the people, like you said, like to look at Seventh-day Adventism as this sort of legalistic religion, and the belief that because there's an investigative judgment, you're all trying to outdo each other with works, and that they're all holier than thou. That's a complete misunderstanding of, I'd say, the gospel message.
Right, it may be a complete misunderstanding, but it is the understanding of many Seventh-day Adventists. So, you're obviously free to say they're wrong, but you'll find precedents for that kind of thinking among some prominent Seventh-day Adventists. And the investigative judgment doctrine may sound complicated to outsiders, but what it really boils down to is the Seventh-day Adventist Church is asserting that it has a unique relationship to God. And just as Jews believe that they're God's chosen people, Seventh-day Adventists effectively believe that they are the highest divine revelation to humanity.
It's, at least from what I've been reading from the early church founders, you're right. There are many modern-day SDAs who might hold that worldview. The position taken by many of the early church founders, Ellen White being one of the biggest writers of the church, I'm sure you know, is that it's just if you love God, you'll keep the commandments. And just because the denomination encourages the keeping of the Sabbath, that doesn't mean only Seventh-day Adventists will be saved, or only Seventh-day Adventists are in the favor of God. It's just they make a set of doctrines and guidelines that are very clearly described in the Bible, but have been muddled through the years. But to ask you, obviously you don't believe in the heavenly sanctuary, but does the Jewish faith in any way talk about heaven? Like how does it view what happens?
Yeah, in the Talmud, there are discussions of heavenly sanctuary, but it just has no significance to the way Jews lead their lives. So things that are a primary concern to Christians are a secondary concern to Jews. Things that are a primary concern to Jews are by and large a secondary consideration to Christians. So, for example, it says in the Torah, you shall not wear a garment made of linen and wool. And this is of great concern to religious Jews. They take great care that they never wear a garment where linen and wool are intermixed. Christians, by and large, don't particularly concern themselves with that commandment. So for Christians, like being a humble person is very important. If you know Jews, you know that being a humble person is not of great importance by and large in Judaism. Like for Christians, heavenly salvation is the most important thing in the world. For Jews, very few Jews care about heavenly salvation. For Christians, faith in God is the most important thing. For Jews, how you behave is the most important thing. So,
I find that Jews and Christians,
let me finish my point.
Sure.
So, Jews and Christians, they both share the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, as a sacred scripture, but they read it completely differently. Jews read it with great concentration on the laws, and Christians read it with a great concentration on the stories. So it's the same scripture, but we look at it through two completely different lenses.
Sure. Modern Jews look at it through the lens of the Talmud, and Christians look at it through the lens of the New Testament. So is that a fair observation to make? And given that I look at the Old Testament through the lens of the revelations that came from the apostles and those who had direct contact with the Son of God, I did find this one verse particularly troubling to me while I was studying Revelation. This is Jesus speaking to John the Revelator. This is in Revelation chapter 2, 9. It's almost as if this message is directly to the last generation, to those who are alive today, people with student loans, people with mortgages, people with debt. I'll read it to you. It's Revelation 2, 9. This is Jesus speaking. I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Now, I found that verse really strange because it seems to talk about how people who call themselves Jews today don't actually observe the same practices of the Old Testament Jews, as if it's this sort of new religion that's taking on the name of Judaism. And it's interesting because I started to notice the practices of modern day Jews don't seem to align with the Old Testament. Things like visiting the Wailing Wall or infant circumcision with a rabbi sort of using their mouth to remove the foreskin. I can't find those specific practices in the Old Testament, in the Torah or the Tanakh. And I was wondering, is that elaborated on in the Talmud, or is there actual biblical evidence for practices like that?
Well, it's no different than there were different Jewish practices 3,500 years ago as opposed to 2,800 years ago. Before there was a temple, or after the temple was destroyed, obviously the way the Jews practiced their religion changed. So there are all these significant differences throughout Jewish history, as there would be with any people. It's not like Jews suddenly changed when Jesus came. There were just as many changes going on before Jesus came. And Judaism has always had to adapt to changing environments. So the Torah is eternal and immutable, but the circumstance in which you apply the Torah and practice the Torah is frequently changing.
Well, that's fascinating you'd mention that, because a lot of the Old Testament, there is a lot of battles of creeping in doctrines to Judaism that the prophets explicitly condemned, one of which being child sacrifices to Moloch. And they seem to have a lot of these practices like star worship in 1 Kings. They threw out these Babylonian pagan worshipers who are worshiping the star. And in Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, when he was under Babylonian captivity, he had a vision from God, and he took him back to the temple at Jerusalem. And he said, look at these abominations that are being committed in my midst. And there were these women who were weeping for Tammuz, which is the son of Nimrod and Semiramis. I mean, just Semiramis. Nimrod had nothing to do with it. And then when he takes him to the outside of the temple of Jerusalem, he finds these men, these elders, with their backs turned to the temple, and they were worshiping the sun in the east. So they were facing towards the east and they were worshiping the sun. And this was considered one of the worst abominations to God. And this is from the Old Testament. This is from Ezekiel. These practices, as you described, these quote unquote changing practices, were things they explicitly condemned. Star worship, sun worship, sacrifices. They said, do not do these things. I do understand that there's been changes happening, not just on the day Jesus came to the scene. There's been all these conflicting changing practices that have been happening. But from what I read is it seemed like they were condemned, not at all incorporated. Not too
No, I gave you the example of how did Jews sacrifice when they didn't have a temple. Obviously, it was different from when they did have a temple. How did Jews practice their religion when they were having to fight on the Sabbath? Obviously, it was different than when they didn't need to fight on the Sabbath. How did Jews practice their religion when they were wandering in the desert, as opposed to when they were developing cities in the land of Israel and developing some prosperity? How did Jews practice when they were living in Babylon in captivity, as opposed to when they were constructing Solomon's temple? So there were all sorts of changes. It wasn't just Jews being suckered into following the ways of the Goyim. So Jews, just like Christians, no more, no less, are profoundly influenced by the people around them. So in this modern world with pornography and TV and the paused out popular culture, Christians are profoundly affected by the pause. Jews are profoundly affected by the pause. And so everybody is affected by the environment in which they live and breathe and have their being. Jews are affected by it, non-Jews are affected by it, Christians are affected by it, Muslims are affected by it.
Can I just say, a man of your stature saying the pause is just, that just made me that made me laugh for some reason. That's true. You're speaking truth. Absolutely. The environment does influence them, and they had to keep away from it. They are trying to fight away from the world, because those first chosen people that were brought out of the land of Egypt, they were one of the last group of people that weren't completely given over to paganism and false god worship, idolatry, star worship, sun and moon worship. And I guess in my research, I've certainly come to the conclusion that the Roman Catholic Church is some kind of enforced sun worship, and Islam is moon worship. And it's amazing how our Gregorian calendar system was made by Pope Gregory XIII, and the universal day of worship, Catholic means universal, is Sunday, the first day of the week, Sunday. Now, what I always was confused by is there are thousands of denominations of Christianity. I'm sure you know this. It's become diluted, all these different denominations. But you'll find, instead of looking at the doctrinal differences, the minor differences between them, I implore you to look at the similarities between all these denominations. And you will find two things, Luke. You'll find that they all worship on Sunday, and they all accept a doctrine of the Trinity, meaning the God who they worship is a 3-in-1, which I believe violates the first commandment. So you have the first commandment being violated with the Trinity, and then you have the fourth commandment being violated by Sunday worship. And that's sort of across all these denominations. It doesn't really matter if you're Lutheran, evangelical, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic. It's just Sunday worship in the Trinity. So that kind of adoption of the worldly practices is what corrupted Christianity and Old Testament Judaism. But you're asserting that the Judaism of today, those adoptions that they had, were not of the world. They were of the elders of Judaism.
I'm not asserting that. I'm saying that Jews, like Christians, have always been influenced by the environment that they find themselves. And so you can find plenty of outside influences on Christianity. Like the idea of Christmas just didn't come from Christians. There were pagan origins. Everything has pagan origins. Everything in Christianity has pagan origins. Everything in Judaism has pagan origins. These religions transformed these pagan practices and pagan outlooks and pagan stories, and they monotheized them Christianize them or they Judaize them. But still, at core, everything in Judaism and Christianity, you can pretty much point to pagan origins.
Absolutely. And that's what I found is if you actually ignore the world and just look at the text, you'll find a condemnation of such practices. And for example, Saturnalia, you can certainly find that to be traced back to Rome as a pagan practice, the practice of worshiping Saturn, Satyr, Kronos, Satan. But the interesting thing is if I go to Jeremiah, there's this very, very eye-opening verse. Jeremiah 10-2. You'll love this. This is from something you're talking about Christmas, something that's really shot out to me. This is from Jeremiah chapter 10. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of the heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vain, for one cutteth the tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They deck it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. And that seems to be a practice of the heathen that's described in Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, condemning the Israelites at the time for doing that. So it seems like there's a strange enmity between biblical Christianity and worldly paganism. But as you and I have both observed, there's been this huge blending of the two. And
right. Every Christian doctrine, you'll find precedents for it in paganism. The idea that God would come to earth to save humanity, you'll find pagan precedents for that. The main Jewish festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, you'll find pagan antecedents for that. The flood story in the Bible, you'll find pagan.
Epic of Gilgamesh.
Right.
Talks about the flood story.
Yeah, from everything has pagan origins. Like religions of Judaism and Christianity did not just spring from the sky with absolutely no reference to what has come before them. Now, the person of faith will look at God as directing the process for the creation of a holy people, or a scholar who does not use the lens of faith will just easily elaborate all the pagan origins. And speaking of scholarship, there's this Jewish professor of the New Testament. Her name is Amy Jill Levine. I've spoken to her several times, and she is a professor at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. And she was telling me that whenever they get Seventh-day Adventists coming to study graduate level studies of religion, they always have to sit them down and let them know that traditional Seventh-day Adventist hatred of other religions, such as Catholicism, is just not going to be tolerated at graduate school.
It wouldn't be a very scholarly environment if they're just going about punching every Catholic they saw, because that's like what they do. You see a Seventh-day Adventist, they're immediately just lunging at the Catholics. But I do know that there's a historical animosity towards the Catholic Church. But yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the pagan roots of all religions. This is the third time I'm mentioning it, and I apologize. I'm going through the Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, and the claim that he makes, and again, this comes from a biblical worldview, where you take the Genesis story literally. I know no one does that today. Everyone thinks that's incredibly stupid. Genesis is just poetry. Don't take it literally. If you take the Genesis story literally, what he asserts is that at the building of the Tower of Babel, Nimrod had the entire world under a false religion, a false unified religion. And what happened is, as I'm sure you know, when the Tower of Babel was continuing being built, God confounded all of the languages. And the languages now were all confused, and man was forced to disperse and separate into their own groups based on the languages that they were accustomed to or able to speak to. Now, that unified religion that they all once had was carried on into each of these separate groups from the descendants of Noah. And at least what he asserts is that the original religion was based around Nimrod, Semiramis, and the son Tammuz. Now, Nimrod was killed by Shem, the descendant of Noah. And what happened is he was cut up into 13 pieces. And Semiramis, of course, was really sad about this. But afterwards, she became pregnant Now, it's pretty hard to get pregnant with your husband if he's dead. So she claimed that she was a virgin. Oh, it's a virgin birth. I have a miracle son. And she called her son Tammuz. Now, Tammuz didn't look anything like Nimrod, but people were, okay, it's the virgin birth. And she claimed, oh, it's Nimrod reincarnated through Tammuz. And then when Tammuz died, she then claimed, oh, he is risen through the sun. And this Babylonian mystery religion is found in all religions, as you described today, paganism, the pagan roots of most religions say. You find it in every religion. You find it in Hinduism, and you find it in Buddhism. You find it in this imagery of the mother and her son, the widow's son. And if you really look back into it, Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz, they were the first incomprehensible trinity. They were the first trinity that people were forced to worship. That it's this sort of mystery religion that could encode itself in different names because there were different languages that were trying to keep and maintain their worship of Nimrod. And this is all substantiated only by speculation and historical evidence. He has a lot of diagrams in there, ancient discoveries they found in Assyria, and it shows that Nimrod had many different names. He had Sargon of Akkad was one of his names. He believed that the Epic of Gilgamesh was actually just describing the life of Nimrod. And it just, if you go from the biblical record, in Genesis chapter 10, it describes Nimrod as being a king of Assyria at the time. And Sargon of Akkad is known as the first king of Assyria. So those are the kind of speculations that he makes in that pamphlet to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. So I want to
tell you a funny story that I heard about a funny sermon I heard about Nimrod, and to see the humor in it, you have to remember I heard it in 2009, and this guy got up to speak about Nimrod, and he said, well, here you have a proud black man who came along and said, yes, we can unite the country. Yes, we can unite the world. Yes, we can have socialized medicine. And the crowd at my synagogue just cracked up.
Parallels are uncanny, right? Yeah, Dan.
I've got about 20 more minutes. So
sure.
Go ahead, hit me with what you want.
Yeah, so I definitely discovered, what led your path to Judaism, and I guess the other questions I would ask you about your current observance. You said you definitely keep the Sabbath. How different is your Sabbath keeping now from when you were a Seventh-day Adventist? You said it's more strict, but how so?
Well, as a Seventh-day Adventist, you're allowed to drive on the Sabbath. As an Orthodox Jew, you're not allowed to drive. Seventh-day Adventist, you're allowed to turn on a light switch on the Sabbath. As an Orthodox Jew, you're not allowed to turn on a light switch. Seventh-day Adventist, you're allowed to use the telephone on the Sabbath. As an Orthodox Jew, you're not allowed to use the telephone on the Sabbath. As a Seventh-day Adventist, you can warm up food on the Sabbath. As an Orthodox Jew, you can't alter any heat or electrical current. So just the laws are just far more demanding, far more minute, and have far greater importance to the way it's practiced. So in Seventh-day Adventists, it's maybe more about principles than in Judaism. It's more about observing specific laws.
Well, I wanted to ask you, as a Jew, I was looking into the fourth commandment laid out in Exodus chapter 20, and it says you shouldn't have any servants or handmaidens. Is that why they don't use any electricity? Is it because they believe that by using electricity that goes back to some kind of electrical company that's causing some kind of work?
No, you're allowed to have electricity. You're just not allowed to start or stop an electrical current. And that actually goes to the law about creating a fire on the Sabbath. So elsewhere in the Torah, not in the Ten Commandments, you're not allowed to create a fire on the Sabbath. And then when electricity came around in the 19th century, Orthodox rabbis had these big arguments about whether or not electricity was fire. And there were prominent Orthodox rabbis who said it was not fire, but the majority decision came down that electricity was fire. Therefore, you're not allowed to start a fire on the Sabbath. That's the reason you can't drive on the Sabbath, because when you turn the key to start your car, you fire the ignition spark plugs, and that's why you can't drive.
No, that's eye-opening to me, because I was always under the false assumption that they were trying to, prevent all forms of servants, paying servants in some way. And that's interesting. So it's fire. That's really, wow, that's new to me. Have you ever seen the practice of, or ever used what they call, I believe, a Shabbos Goyim, or like a helper on the day?
All the time. So there are many laws again about Shabbos Goy, but for example, if you need to have a light switch turned on, you can't directly ask a non-Jew, but you can hint. You can say, "Oh, it'd be really nice to have light in this room right now." Or if the air conditioning set too high or too low, you can say to the non-Jew, like most synagogues employ non-Jews to clean up and to do all the tedious work. And so you educate them that when you say to them, "Oh, it'd be really nice to have it cooler or warmer in here," they understand then what they need to do. Or you can't use an umbrella on the Sabbath because that's creating a building in the perspective of Jewish law. But if you need an umbrella, say, to shade from the sun, you can say, "Oh, it'd be really nice to have some shade here," or "It'd be really nice for this or that." And then particularly if the non-Jew is an employee, then they've been educated to get the hint. And if they're not an employee, then often non-Jews are very nice, and they're often willing to help out. Or sometimes you'll just pay them. You'll pay the non-Jew to come to your home if you're in a freezing cold climate and create a fire on Sabbath morning.
Oh, what? So you can pay someone on, because at least what I do for my Sabbath observance is I try to avoid buying and selling anything on the day, and I do cook on the day of the Sabbath, though I know some other people in the church who actually have their food prepared in advance, because that is something that's mentioned in the Old Testament. But yeah, that's interesting, because having someone hired working at temple or the synagogue, so I'm looking at the seventh commandment right now, Exodus chapter 20:10. It's like, in it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy daughter, thy manservant, or nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates.
Right. So it depends what is work. And so the rabbis legislate what is work, because obviously rabbis work harder on the seventh day than they work on the other 6 days of the week. And you don't literally pay them on the seventh day. You pay your employees, on another day for the labor that they perform for you. So this is an example of how Judaism has never been sola scriptura. Only the Karaites, this tiny minority sect, being basically sola scriptura. But Judaism has always been the way of life of a particular people, and the way of life of a particular people always has oral traditions on how to interpret and apply things in changing circumstances.
Yeah, and it's something I've always seen is the Bible's language is so terse. Like, it's just one sentence that describes this entire battle. So I could see how there would be a need for someone to elaborate on some of these laws and add upon it. But the interesting thing is, when Jesus Christ came and debated with the Pharisees, he seemed to say that you've added laws. Like, you're not just elaborating on them. You've added all of these extra laws, and you've made it a burden. This day, what the Sabbath is the day of remembrance that God created the heaven and the earth. And you should be celebrating, rejoicing all for that God has given you and all that he continues to give to you in knowledge and truth. And what happened is, actually, at one point, I don't know if you know the story, the Pharisees wanted to kill Jesus because he healed someone. He healed someone on the Sabbath, and they wanted to consider that work. And
actually, but from the perspective of Jewish law, the type of healing that Jesus did on the Sabbath would not be a problem. It would fall under the category of pikuach nefesh, which is to save a life, and it's not literally even just saving a life. But that's one of the reasons that Jews don't find the Gospels to be authentic, because the things that Jesus was doing on the Sabbath in healing were no violation of Jewish law.
Okay. So you don't see that same spirit of the Pharisees observed in modern Judaism at all? with all these extra
No,
mandates
you
and laws.
see, as a Jew, you see the Gospels as essentially fraudulent documents. And so any Jew with any knowledge of Judaism can open up the Gospels and immediately see, oh, this is obviously fake. So that's the Jewish perspective.
Yeah. And then you got Revelation saying, oh, well, they're both discounting each other. I totally see what you mean. Because then it's like Revelation saying, yeah, they're not really Jews. But then they're saying, hey, us, we are Jews. This is clearly not at all what we practice. So yeah, I could see how there's a huge conflict there. And what does, I don't know, do we have enough time? There's like 5 minutes left.
Yeah, no, we got 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure. This might be my last question, but this has been an excellent discussion, by the way. What does your rabbi or just anyone you know in your religious community, what do they think of the Apostle Paul? Do they think his writings do you think he's just a total fraud? Do you think he's just an apostate, or what the Paul question,
well, the average Jew thinks about the Apostle Paul as often as you think about some leading imam of the 12th century, which is not at all. I mean, you don't lose any sleep about what some imam in the 12th century says. And so I've never met a Jew who was particularly concerned about anything that Paul said. But as far as Jewish scholars of Paul, they would see him as a confidence man. So Paul said, to the Greeks, I was the quintessential Greek. To the Jews, I was the quintessential Jew. So they'd see someone who was a trickster, a fraudster, and a confidence man. And from a non-Christian perspective, virtually all non-Christian scholars of Christianity see Paul as the real founder of Christianity, that he ascribed all sorts of things to Jesus that Jesus would have been completely appalled by. So it's interesting that Paul shaped the development of Christianity as opposed to the people who actually knew the historical Jesus.
Well, yeah, his epistles are definitely used as foundational for a lot of the teachings of Christianity, but he didn't write the Gospels. He didn't write the book of Acts, though he's mentioned in the book of Acts quite a bit. He didn't write Revelation. He didn't write, the letters of John. He didn't write the letter of Peter's, but he did write, yes, a majority of the epistles to the Thessalonians, Corinthians, and so on and so forth. And there's one letter to the Thessalonians that I would imagine bring quite a bit of anger to some Jews, especially in my streams. Luke, whenever I stream and I have a Jew, they said, don't mention this. But in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14, the Apostle Paul writes in his letter, he says, for you have suffered all like things of your countrymen, even as they have of the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and their own prophets, and have persecuted us, and they please not God, and are contrary to all men. So yeah, I would just imagine that if there are any modern day Jews reading that, they might be rather upset by the Apostle Paul. But as you said, yeah.
Well, I mean, do you get upset by what imams say about Christianity? Probably not, because you regard Islam as a fraudulent faith. So from a Jewish perspective, Christianity is pure idolatry. So the number of Jews who are going to be upset by things said by Christians is pretty small, unless Christians have the power and the will to physically hurt Jews. As long as Christians aren't burning Jews at the stake, Jews generally regard anything that's in the Christian scriptures or said by Christian clergy as significant to them as you would regard the pronouncements of imams in Saudi Arabia.
I don't know, that makes a lot of sense. I think a more apt analogy would be if John the Revelator converted to Islam. I know it's not possible. I know Islam came many years later, but imagine if someone who is so central to the teachings of your faith. Now, the Apostle Paul, he was a Pharisee.
Well, that's what he claims, but when you study his writings, it's pretty clear that he's never learned even Hebrew. So someone who was not literate in Hebrew could never have been a Pharisee. So that's another reason why scholars regard Paul as a con man, meaning non-Christian scholars by and large, because his translations of the Hebrew Bible are always done obviously from the Greek Septuagint translation. It's obvious that he doesn't know Hebrew. And so his claim to be a Pharisee, let alone to have studied under Rabbi Gamliel, is regarded as absurd.
So that means Luke was lying as well, because in the book of Acts, he says that when Stephen, as I mentioned before, about the connection with the star of Remphan and Moloch, when he said that to the Pharisees, he was stoned to death. They were very upset that he made that connection. And one of the Pharisees who actually approved of that was Saul of Tarsus. who would later become Paul the Apostle. And
yeah,
Luke,
so when a Jew reads that, they get that, that's absurd. Jews would never have stoned someone for this kind of speech or behavior. They would have simply, thought the person was insane.
So,
like when you encounter someone who's insane, you generally, you don't feel a great deal of enmity for them. You just, want to keep your distance from people who are saying insane things.
No, it's interesting. So it seems as though every claim against Judaism in the New Testament is just fraudulent, or it's not what we practice at all today. And then at the same time, in the first century, you have this one apostle saying, yeah, there will be these people who will call themselves Jews but aren't really. So it's like this sort of deadlock that both are in. Both are criticizing and giving railing accusations to one another, and it's stuck in that. But the last thing I wanted to say before I go, so that we can end the stream, but which has been great, by the way, I forgot to mention what really solidified my faith in sort of taking the Gospels as truth, as historical truth. And I hope you're interested in hearing this because I'm going to mention it for as quickly as I can. I was on a vacation in India, and I don't know if you know this, there's actually a small portion of India that is Christian. It's located in the southwest of the subcontinent, right at the coast. Now, the majority religion of India is Hinduism, and there's a growing Muslim population with the border at Pakistan. But in that small southwest region, there is a Christian population, and that's where I was visiting for vacation. Now, while I was there, I was just amazed by these beautiful cathedrals they had next to these 3,000-year-old Hindu temples. So what I was asking around and learning, I found out that the region had been Hindu since 1400 BC. And I'm saying, okay, so if they've been Hindu for more than 1,000 years, when and why did they convert to Christianity? Well, according to an oral tradition, because they didn't write down their history, according to the oral tradition of the region, they changed to Christianity around 56 to 70 AD. That's like 25 to 30 years after Jesus Christ was crucified. I was like, wow, that's kind of impressive, but why? Why is this little coastal region in India, why are they Christian in first century AD? What's going on? They call themselves the St. Thomas Christians. And the story, before I can go further with it, requires you to know that there is no unified one language in India. There's Hindi, Tamil Nadu, Malayalam. There's all these different languages in India. And the region that I was in, they speak Malayalam. So I was really confused at how in the first century, the Apostle Thomas could have possibly traveled to here, because he was a Hebrew who likely spoke Aramaic, how he could travel to this region and convert a region that has been Hindu for over 1,000 years when they speak Malayalam. And he spoke Aramaic. Like, what is that? Did he have a translator? Did he have someone helping him? How does that work? Because a translator, you don't convert someone's religion through a translator. So I'm thinking, what, did he just like learn the language? How did he do it? What got my attention is in the book of Acts from the New Testament. In chapter 2, it describes that on the day of Pentecost, the apostles were filled with Jesus' Holy Spirit, and they were given the power to preach the gospel in every single language. And it says, now when this was noised abroad, the multitude, meaning Jews from all over the Middle East, they came together and they were amazed because that every man heard them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and marveled, saying one to another, behold, are these not which speak Galileans? And how can we hear them, every man in our own tongue, wherein we were born? Parthians, Medes, dwellers in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia. They could all hear the gospel being preached in their language. So that means the Apostle Thomas could preach the gospel in Hebrew, in Greek, in Aramaic, and Malayalam. Yeah, there you go. And when I realized that, it was like, like mind blown. I was like, wow, there's some kind of historical authenticity to the New Testament, not just the Old Testament. The New Testament has these really, really strong historical ties that can be verified, and not just, oh, Rome existed. Did you know Rome was real? Oh, it's mentioned in the New Testament. There you go. There's a lot more to it. So yeah, that's an example of how I started to take the New Testament and the gospel message seriously. So I want to leave that with you, and thank you for having me on. Is there anything you want to ask me?
Not right now. Just, I mean, I think we agree that if you take your religion seriously, then other religions are going to seem at best weird, and in all likelihood, downright evil. So if you take Christianity seriously, Jews are stiff-necked rejectors of God and frauds. If you take Judaism seriously, Christianity is pure idolatry. And if you're either a Jew or Christian, Islam is satanic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the thing is, I would rather than myopically just shut off all religions, I love to understand their roots, to study them, to really understand more than, oh, they're heretics. You're talking to a Roman Catholic when they've called you a heretic within 5 minutes of talking to them. But I like to look like, what is the origins? What is the root? What is the meaning of the star that I see all over many Jews who use that symbol, the Star of David? Where did the name David? Why was it attributed to David? That kind of stuff. That's why I like to study. But yeah, this has been a great stream. Really eye opening. I learned a lot. Now, why electricity is sort of not done. It's the fire. That's great. No, it's good to know. So I learned a lot. This has been great. I hope you enjoyed this discussion.
Very much, Ford. And I'm sure we'll do it again. So thanks for being the driving force behind this stream, and it was good to talk to you, sir.
All right. See you later.
Thank you. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.